Imagine waking up one day to the sound of sirens, not songs. To the silence of empty streets, where children once played. What happens when a land becomes more than just earthwind? It becomes a memory, a wound, a battleground of identity. Today, we journey through the story of a war that shaped nations and scarred generations, the history of the Azerbaijan military attack war. The Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is one of the most complex and long-standing disputes in the post-Soviet region. At its core, it centers around a mountainous region located within the internationally recognized borders of Azerbaijan. However, the majority of the population in this region has been ethnic Armenian for decades. During the Soviet era, Nagorno-Karabakh was an autonomous oblast under Azerbaijan's control. But tensions simmered between the Armenian and Azerbaijani populations over questions of identity, governance, and historical grievances. As the Soviet Union weakened in the late 1980s, these tensions erupted into open demands by Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh for unification with Armenia. This sparked protests, political disputes, and eventually violent clashes between ethnic groups. Began as demonstrations and political movements soon evolved into a full-scale conflict. Pogroms and attacks were reported in both Armenia and Azerbaijan, leading to a breakdown of trust and mass displacements. In the wake of the Soviet collapse in 1991, both newly independent countries claimed sovereignty over the region, and the local Armenian population declared independence as the Republic of Artsakh, move not recognized internationally. Azerbaijan rejected this and launched military efforts to assert control. The fighting that followed was brutal and involved not just soldiers, but also civilians caught in the middle. The conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh isn't only about geography. It involves deep historical narratives, cultural identity, and emotional wounds carried by both Armenians and Azerbaijanis. Each side believes in the justice of its claim, and both have experienced loss. For Azerbaijan, the region represents an integral part of its national territory, while for Armenians, it's seen as a historical homeland with deep religious and cultural significance. This conflict set the stage for decades of tension, displacement, failed negotiations, and, eventually, renewed war. The First Nagorno-Karabakh War began in the late 1980s, and intensified after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, as Armenia and Azerbaijan emerged as independent nations. Their competing claims over Nagorno-Karabakh escalated into a full-scale war. Ethnic Armenians in the region, backed by Armenia, sought independence or unification with Armenia, while Azerbaijan insisted on maintaining its territorial integrity. The war was marked by fierce battles, ethnic cleansing, and large-scale civilian casualties on both sides. What started as local skirmishes evolved into a brutal conflict involving heavy artillery, sieges, and widespread destruction of towns and villages during the war. Armenian forces not only took control of Nagorno-Karabakh, but also occupied 7 surrounding Azerbaijani districts, creating a security buffer zone. This led to the displacement of nearly 800,000 Azerbaijanis, many of whom became internally displaced persons, living in harsh conditions for decades. The international community, including the United Nations, passed several resolutions affirming Azerbaijan's territorial integrity and calling for the withdrawal of occupying forces, but these were not enforced. Armenia, on the other hand, justified its military actions as a means of protecting the ethnic Armenian population in the region, arguing they faced existential threats under Azerbaijani rule. The war officially ended in 1994 with a Russian-brokered ceasefire. By that time, an estimated 30,000 people had lost their lives, and both economies were deeply damaged. Despite the ceasefire, no formal peace treaty was signed, and the region remained under Armenian control. This outcome left Azerbaijan with a strong sense of injustice and loss, fueling decades of anger and a desire to reclaim the lost territories. The unresolved nature of the war and the fragile ceasefire created a tense status quo that held for years but remained vulnerable to renewed violence. In September 2020, the long-standing tensions between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh erupted into a second full-scale war. Unlike the first conflict, the 2020 war was marked by high-intensity fighting and advanced military technology. Azerbaijan launched a coordinated military offensive with the objective of reclaiming territories that had been under Armenian control. Since the 1990s, the war lasted 44 days and resulted in significant territorial gains for Azerbaijan. Backed by years of military modernization and strategic alliances, Azerbaijan used drones, precision-guided munitions, and real-time surveillance to target Armenian positions effectively. Turkish-made Bayraktar drones and Israeli-supplied weaponry played a crucial role in weakening Armenian defenses. Throughout the conflict, Azerbaijani forces captured key strategic areas, including the cities of Fuzuli, Jabrail, Zanjalan, and Shusha. The capture of Shusha, a city of cultural and military significance, marked a turning point in the war and paved the way for Azerbaijan's final push. Armenia, facing mounting losses and limited international support, agreed to a ceasefire brokered by Russia on November 10, 2020. According to the terms of the agreement, Armenia withdrew from several occupied districts outside Nagorno-Karabakh, while a Russian peacekeeping force was deployed to monitor the situation and maintain stability in the region. The war caused significant casualties on both sides and led to renewed displacement of civilians. Thousands of soldiers and civilians died, and infrastructure across the region was heavily damaged. For Azerbaijan, the outcome was seen as a major victory and the restoration of national pride. For Armenia, it was a moment of national grief and political crises. The war also reshaped the regional balance of power, strengthening Turkey's role and reinforcing Russia's position as a key mediator. Despite the ceasefire, tensions remained high, and the underlying issues of identity, sovereignty, and security remained unresolved. Azerbaijan's military modernization played a critical role in its success during the 2020 conflict. Following the First Nagorno-Karabakh War and the loss of large territories, Azerbaijan began a long-term effort to rebuild and strengthen its armed forces, fueled by significant oil and gas revenues. The country invested heavily in modern weaponry, advanced technology, and training. One of the most significant advancements was the acquisition of unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, particularly Turkish-made Bayraktar TB2 drones and Israeli drones like the Herop. These systems allowed Azerbaijan to conduct precision strikes, gather real-time intelligence, and neutralize Armenian air defense systems and armored units with great efficiency. In addition to drones, Azerbaijan upgraded its artillery, air defense, and missile systems. Partnerships with countries like Turkey, Israel, and Russia allowed Azerbaijan to access sophisticated equipment and training programs. Turkey, in particular, provided not only hardware but also military advisors and strategic guidance. Azerbaijani soldiers were trained in NATO-style tactics and participated in joint exercises that improved coordination and readiness. The military also enhanced its command and control systems, enabling more agile decision-making and battlefield awareness. Another key factor was the emphasis on professionalizing the military. Azerbaijan invested in the education and development of its officer corps and established specialized units capable of carrying out complex operations. These efforts created a more disciplined and capable force ready to engage in modern warfare. During the 2020 war, this modernization translated into decisive advantages on the battlefield. Azerbaijani forces conducted rapid offensives with a high degree of coordination, minimizing their own casualties while inflicting heavy losses on Armenian positions. The success of these efforts demonstrated how modernization, strategic alliances, and technology can transform a military and shift the balance of power in a long-standing conflict. Throughout the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, numerous ceasefires and diplomatic initiatives were attempted, but most failed to bring lasting peace. The international community, particularly the OSCE Minsk group coached by Russia, the United States, and France worked for decades to mediate between Armenia and Azerbaijan. These efforts produced proposals and frameworks for negotiation, but deep mistrust, nationalistic sentiment, and conflicting goals on both sides often led to deadlock. Each side accused the other of bad faith, and even when ceasefires were agreed upon, violations occurred frequently along the line of contact. Skirmishes and sniper fire became a routine part of life for soldiers and civilians living near the disputed zones. Diplomatic talks were further complicated by the absence of mutual recognition regarding the political status of Nagorno-Karabakh. Armenia supported the self-declared Republic of Artsakh, while Azerbaijan insisted on its territorial integrity and refused any proposal that hinted at independence for the region. As a result, even when negotiations progressed, they were undermined by fundamental disagreements on core principles. Confidence-building measures, such as prisoner exchanges or joint humanitarian efforts, were proposed but rarely sustained due to renewed hostilities or political shifts. The 2020 war briefly changed the diplomatic landscape, as Azerbaijan regained significant territory and entered ceasefire negotiations from a stronger position. A Russian-brokered agreement ended the fighting and introduced Russian peacekeepers into the region to monitor the situation. However, the agreement did not resolve the core political status of Nagorno-Karabakh, leaving the conflict frozen once again. While the ceasefire reduced large-scale violence, the region remained tense with occasional flare-ups and accusations of ceasefire breaches. The underlying tensions, historical grievances, and national pride continued to block long-term peace efforts. Without a mutually acceptable solution, diplomacy in this conflict remained fragile and vulnerable to collapse at any moment. The human impact of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict has been profound and deeply painful for both Azerbaijan and Armenians. Throughout decades of war, occupation, and displacement, civilians have borne the heaviest burden. During the First Nagorno-Karabakh War, hundreds of thousands of Azerbaijanis were forced to flee their homes in and around the region. Becoming internally displaced persons, many lived in temporary shelters, abandoned buildings, and refugee camps for years, struggling with poverty and uncertainty. Similarly, Armenian civilians in conflict areas also endured trauma, losing family members, homes, and their sense of security. The 2020 war renewed this cycle of suffering. Entire communities were uprooted within days as towns and villages came under attack. Families were separated, and civilians lived in fear as artillery and drone strikes struck populated areas. Hospitals, schools, and homes were damaged or destroyed, leaving lasting scars on the landscape and the people. Both sides reported civilian deaths and injuries, often in towns far from the front lines. The emotional toll was immense, especially for children growing up in environments filled with fear, violence, and loss. The end of active combat did not mean the end of pain. Many displaced Azerbaijanis returned to territories that had been reduced to rubble, where infrastructure had collapsed, and mines still posed deadly risks. On the Armenian side, communities mourned the loss of soldiers and territory, while political unrest and economic challenges deepened the hardship. Grief, resentment, and fear continue to shape the lives of those affected. The trauma of war has been passed down through generations, creating narratives of loss and injustice that make reconciliation more difficult. Healing from such deep wounds requires not only time but also mutual recognition of suffering, empathy, and efforts toward rebuilding both trust and communities torn apart by decades of conflict. The story of the Azerbaijan military attack war is not just about battles, borders, or victories. It is a story of people, pain, and perseverance. From the deep roots of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict to the modern warfare of 2020, each chapter has left behind wounded hearts, broken homes, and unanswered questions. While the land has changed hands and the maps have shifted, what remains is the human cost, the lives disrupted, the children displaced, and the generations shaped by war. True peace cannot be written in ceasefire agreements alone. It must be nurtured through understanding, healing, and remembering the shared humanity of those on all sides. If there is a path forward, it lies not in weapons, but in empathy, dialogue, and the courage to imagine a future beyond conflict.